You know what I got the other day, Pete? Stephen King's latest. Want to borrow it?
Do you know who you're talking to?
What do you mean?
Andy, when's the last time I read a paper book? It's been decades. I would much rather use Kindle, or better yet, Audible.
What am I thinking? I don't read paper books anymore either. I'm an audiobook guy all the way. For those looking to listen to the books behind the films that we talk about here on Movies We Like, not to mention all the other podcasts in the Next Reel family, get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at thenextreel.com/audible.
There are so many great adaptations from movies we like available in audio form.
Early on, we covered Casino Royale with director Matthew Gratzner. You went through all of the 007 books on Audible, right?
I did indeed. What a series. We also covered Room with legendary Dee Wallace and Never Let Me Go with costume designer Alana Moorehead.
We chatted about Fat City with cinematographer Sam Levy and Silver Linings Playbook with the great composer Harry Gregson Williams.
101 Dalmatians and Bambi.
Apocalypse Now, There Will Be Blood, The Thin Red Line.
There's so many great adaptations with so many great guests, and you can get all these as audiobooks on Audible, along with thousands of other great reads.
Producing this podcast is a lot of fun, but it does take a lot of time. We have already dropped the dynamically inserted ads because they are so annoying and have no connection to our content.
Plus, they just jam those things in wherever they see fit.
We listened when you said you didn't like them. So now, we're directly appealing to you, our dear listener. Please consider an Audible subscription to help support Movies We Like and the Next Reel's family of podcasts.
I've been using Audible along with my family for decades now. I love it, and I've read hundreds of books through it. Couldn't be more pleased with their service, and I know you'll love it too. Head to thenextreel.com/audible and get your free trial. It really helps us out. And you have a world of over 200,000 audiobooks open to you.
So much great material available. Dive in with a free trial and get your first free audiobook at thenextreel.com/audible.
Start listening to amazing audiobooks of your favorite movie source material with your first free audiobook today. That's thenextreel.com/audible. Andy, I know you've never been happier than when you're sitting by a warm fire, snuggled up in a flannel and basking in the glow of an old-school budget spreadsheet.
It is a special day I can shut down the world for a little me time.
In a world full of applications, why do these antiquated documents and spreadsheets still run the world? And why haven't they been updated in over 50 years? That's why we want to talk about Coda.
Coda is a new kind of doc that brings words, data, and teams together. It comes with a set of building blocks that anyone can combine to create a doc as powerful as an app.
Coda runs our entire business here at True Story FM, from show scheduling across dozens of podcasts and scripts for thousands of episodes, to budgets and plans and wikis and more.
Coda lets us see our business in a new light. If you'd like to shine a light on productivity in your business and save money along the way, check out Coda today at thenextreel.com/Coda. Welcome to Movies We Like, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. I'm Andy Nelson, and that over there is Pete Wright.
I'm Pete Wright.
On today's episode, we have invited cinematographer Lyn Moncrief to talk about Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, a movie he likes. Lyn, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are thrilled to have you to talk about this movie. This is a big movie. You sent over a lot of interesting movie potentials to talk about, and we picked this one because there's so much to talk about with this movie. So we are thrilled to chat about this one.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, we booked the rest of the afternoon with you so that we can really, really dig in.
This could be a conversation for a long time on this movie.
Right.
Yes.
One episode per story, pretty much. Exactly. Well, before we start talking about Magnolia, and we'll certainly have plenty to talk about that, let's talk a little bit about you and your work as a cinematographer. So let's just start at the beginning. How did you kind of end up finding cinematography and becoming somebody behind the camera?
From an early age, I was always fascinated with movies. My parents were fascinated with movies. So in some ways, I kind of blame my parents because they took me to everything. I remember it just as like one anecdote. My mom took me out of school one day to go see a reprint of Lawrence of Arabia.
Wow.
So that's how, of one of many examples of kind of where just the love of cinema was from my parents. And they're not involved in filmmaking in any aspect. You know, when I started to go through junior high and high school, I was very involved in still photography as well. Took all the photography classes with the dark room and did everything. And I think just once I got to college and started taking cinema classes, when I was going, they were still doing film projects on film. And I found that because of my background in still photography, I was one of the few students that could actually expose correctly for a lot of these 16 millimeter projects that we had to do. And so from there, a lot of my classmates would ask me to shoot their movies. And through that process and that time and starting to understand who does what on movies, became very clear in that era that, okay, this is what I want to pursue.
Well, and you spent, I mean, quite a while, like working in shorts and independent cinema and everything. Like you were doing this you've been doing it for quite a long time, like building up your portfolio, working on a huge variety of projects. And, I suppose the key with all of that is always, building your network and making connections and showing people that you know what you're doing. And I think something that I find interesting as I look through a lot of the projects you did, not all of the projects, but certainly there has been a draw to films that are a little more thriller, horror. You certainly have been drawn to a lot of those sorts of stories. And I wonder did you find yourself like happily pigeonholed doing all of that, or is that a direction?
Yeah, what do we have your mom and dad to thank for that?
Yeah.
Specifically
well, my mom and dad took me all to the big epic. My dad loved Westerns. My mom loved more the art house movies and kind of those things. It was interesting. I think horror film found me, I think, more so than I found horror. And it wasn't only, I've had the later appreciation to what that genre is and can bring, because I was very frightened of horror movies to start off with. I have an older sister, and I remember her having sleepovers with friends, and they would watch like Friday the 13th and these type of movies and absolutely scare themselves. And as a younger brother, I was too scared to even know what that movies they were watching. So it wasn't until really college or after college, until I got hired to shoot. It was my second movie, a horror movie, that director was like, I need you to watch all these films and why they are important. We sat down and watched, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and like John Carpenter's The Thing. And of course, I was already exposed to The Shining, which I love very much, but that was kind of seemed like a broader movie than just like the typical slasher. So over time, I realized within that sandbox of a genre, the horror film, and what like of recent movies like Get Out and some others that, and they've always kind of been there, is that they've been kind of a reflection on other themes than just the simple slasher gore that people expect. But so, yeah, I would say over the last, I kind of started in indie movies. I had gone to AFI, which kind of lends itself into Magnolia in kind of another way. But I went off to American Film Institute and studied cinematography. And when I get out, it was a lot of indie movies. And out of indies, horror movies are kind of part of that. They've made on the cheap, typically. And, I found myself being asked to do more. So in a way, I did get a little pigeonholed. And it's been a bit of, a journeyman's process to kind of to where I've started now and just now start to kind of elevate into bigger budgets. But I have to say, the more I do, the more fun I have each time I do it. And I mean, cinematography, you can really kind of flex your muscles a bit, I think, in horror film, because it tends to rely so much on suspense through camera and lighting and darkness, and some of these elements that as a cinematographer, you really quite fun to delve into than just maybe a standard drama. So I've been very fortunate that, I've worked with really interesting directors of recent in the genre, and that like to push the envelope visually. And so I'm happy to continue to be pigeonholed in it if that needs to be. I mean, I have a great appreciation for so many movies, but I think I take it to a deeper level. I think now that I'm in the craft,
Sure.
and than just beyond just what maybe at face value a lot of people see the genre to be.
It's interesting because there are so many elements within. I suppose every genre has their tropes, but certainly there are a lot in horror that end up, and some of them are specifically camera related, like, framing a character where, somebody's immediately behind them. And when that character moves, you reveal something. Like, do you find yourself playing and like really reveling in the tropes that you get to play with? Do you find yourself saying, how can I do this where I don't fall into just doing it with the trope? But like, how does that play into that process?
I was thinking the other day, I mean, someone's used this analogy before, but, like magic tricks and making movies, there's always been that kind of connection, right? And of course, like Christopher Nolan made that movie, but it kind of discusses, but in some ways it applies to horror too. You've got misdirections and you have your expectations of a framing, and maybe there's an empty doorway behind someone's shoulder, and there's an expectation of the audience of what that suspense lends it to. I had a professor at AFI. He said to us one day, "Is like the scariest shot you could have in a movie is a slow dolly towards a doorway, an empty doorway." And I think it really kind of, the craft of making a horror movie and the craft of a cinematographer involved of that process. Yeah, you should be kind of educated what those elements are, because there is an expectation. How do you play with that expectation? You have false suspense moments, and then the jump scares, and like I said, misdirections and other kind of elements. That's the fun when you do it really well, is you play off what's people's expectation of the genre. And I find it actually quite freeing creatively to work in genre, because it does give you a blueprint in which to work from, and then just kind of like build a different structure off that blueprint.
I think that's I love that you said the slow dolly toward a door, because that gives me a chance to name drop one of my weird obsessions right now, which is Skinamarink. Have you seen that yet? Skinamarink.
No.
Well, now you have homework, Lynn. You didn't know you were coming for homework, but now you have it. Skinamarink. You've got to watch this. It's in terms of just use of camera, and like when you talk about horror tropes, like there is, I want to play with horror tropes, but I also want to beware when I'm falling into the trap of trope, like, because we're so wired for these things that we want to make sure that the audience knows we're playing the greats. Like, we're trying to do something interesting with something that we know you expect, and not we accidentally fell into the trope pit and we're doing just the same thing everybody does. And I look at the tonal differences of the films that you've worked on, just the straight camera tone between things like The Wind and Vengeance and now Five Nights at Freddy's. Very different tones, and yet I think artfully playing the greats. And I think that is to take a movie that turns expectations within genre and makes it feel like I'm in a wholly different universe is a pretty special thing to do. Like, how often are you thinking about, like, am I getting trapped in a trope?
I think it becomes a thing that you talk with the director, for sure. Like, early in the process, you're kind of saying, how are we approaching this movie? You're talking about maybe other visual influences to build that communication. And you kind of say, are we doing the cliched thing? Are we doing the thing that's expected of us? And maybe that's the right thing to do. You don't want to be so anti everything, but I think it's trying to decide, what is the movie we're making? For a lot of the directors I work with, we try to, at least for me, I try to come up with what I call like the visual vocabulary of that movie. Every movie you kind of set your rule sets. I think the audience will always be with you on that ride. If you have the rules that they're committed, you trust the filmmaker, right? And maybe this speaks to Magnolia later, because it has its own kind of, you have to give a lot of faith to watch this movie to believe some of the things that happen. But I just think if you certainly kind of become our own purveyors of your own rule set, and you just have honest conversation. At least I found with the directors, like, are we doing something that we've seen 10,000 times, and is it going to be boring if we do it this way? But for me, going about the thing, I've always tried to be a bit of a chameleon. I'm sure it's for others to decide if I have an own aesthetic or style, but for me, I like to try to do something a little different on every project, and grow from it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking to all of this, I mean, you've worked with director Emma Tammi a few times. The Wind, which Pete mentioned, you did with her, which is kind of a frontier Western prairie horror vibe. So you're kind of crossing the horror and the Western tropes in that one. And most recently, you just did Five Nights at Freddy's, which is, kind of a Chuck E. Cheese horror movie based on, a very popular video game. So you're also finding that there are a lot of elements within, not even necessarily tropes, but certainly within the world that had already been created, and how are we going to adapt that? And this I suppose leads to all the different conversations that you have with Emma over the course of both of these projects, as far as, because I mean, just, I've seen The Wind, I've seen the trailer for Five Nights. Obviously they look vastly different. And so I think that's, an interesting element, and probably speaks to your point of like the conversations that you need to have about, okay, what are the signatures that we're going to include in this to make sure that that the camera work feels like it fits in the world that we're depicting here?
Yeah, absolutely. With Emma, character, story, emotions, these are things that, it's very important to her. And so when we first outlined, it's been, Five Nights was my fourth movie with her. The Wind was the very first movie. But I have to say, even though The Wind was very tiny, at least 30 times larger budget-wise was,
For Five Nights?
Five Nights. I mean, it certainly expands, but I would say our process was the same. I mean, we sat down with the script and the material, and again, kind of went through, and Emma really likes to create rules, like have assigned elements that, what is the emotion of the scene? What is the character going through? We only move the camera for this particular thematic element. We don't move the camera for other. When you look at The Wind, it's all about not moving the camera. It only moves very specific things when you get into this kind of supernatural element. That was like our Bergman movie, because we reference a lot of Bergman, a lot of Kurosawa. It was a very specific framings, and very can we make a captivating movie without moving the camera? She wanted that just very specific framing. Five Nights is very departure of that, but it's still like the process was like, what is the emotion of the scene? What are the characters? What's our emotional perspective of this? And let's have rules that we only do this type of camera movement or framing or lenses for this, and only for that. We set sometimes not what we do or what we don't do, and maybe we don't use certain colors for certain scenes, and we associate. She tried to break it down in every department, and I try to bring my own thoughts to the table for that as well. And so it's interesting that when you go from such different budgets, the process has remained the same with both of us. And, for Freddy's, we really wanted to kind of push both of ourselves out of our comfort zones of how do you approach this material. And obviously it was different because we're adapting it from source material, and you have to kind of adhere to certain elements that's very loved by the fans of this movie as a very popular video game.
Really begs the question, that's one of my big questions, is video game movies are not historically celebrated by their fans so much. And I'm curious, I just, as a sidebar, how did you rationalize that? And I'll say you and Emma and the team, here we are taking this property that is beloved by its fans and think, okay, we're ready. We're the team to take this on and try to do something different.
What's interesting about the video game, and I think maybe is different from other adaptations, although there's been more success recently, like The Last of Us, which I think was awesome. I mean, I didn't know anything about the video game, but I thought the series was really well done. And you've got like Mario Brothers and all these other kind of iterations. But, I think Five Nights was already a unique video game within the video game world. And I wasn't like a big gamer, but, it started as it is, or was, and continues to be like an independent, video game created by one person versus maybe other video games from much larger kind of conglomerate. And I think it had its own kind of cult status as a video game. And I think when we translated over, that the creator Scott was already so involved in the making of the movie as well, that I think it lends itself different. And the way that it was put to was really making a movie for the fans than necessarily like diluting it. I think the hope was, the perspective was like, let's really make it for the fans and what they love about the video game, and expand it, and hope that it expands to a wider audience versus like diluting, where I think other movies have diluted to try to only open it to a broad base. And I think that was kind of the unique kind of philosophy that was pressed upon when I came in, that it really had to. So I think it just has a different take, and I hope it'll be interesting what the response is. But I from what I gather, a lot of people are very excited for the movie.
Well, and I think that great point, like having Scott Cawthon on with his name as high as it is in the production team is really important. What'd you do to get yourself in the zone of this movie? Are you one of the crew that played through the whole thing? Did you?
I don't think I never got past the third night.
Okay.
I did play the game. I watched a lot of YouTubers play the game. What was interesting is I have a 9-year-old daughter. So once I started to accumulate lots of research for this, for a lot of books, and I started watching the game, and I had bought the game on my Switch, and my daughter was like, "What are you doing? What is this? What is this world? Can I learn about it?" And so I've kind of joked before, like she became my unofficial research assistant, because she became so obsessed with it and wanted to see every YouTuber play it, that every day she would tell me some new fact. And she read, because the canon's quite large there, there's novels and different things. And I'd bought all that, and she started reading all the books and telling me different aspects from it. So just even from a media, you see how quickly people have responded to this world, which I think gave me a new just appreciation of what I was about to undertake with this. But sadly, I never survived the full 5 nights.
I'm so sorry for your loss.
Much of what Emma wanted to really bring from it was really the experience of like when you play it, the first person experience of of the terror of not knowing. Like, you only get glimpses of things, the hearing of stuff, not knowing what's beyond the door. There's kind of jump scare beats. It had to have that still like core to it of the movie, even though you're translating a totally different narrative, and you have to draw people in, obviously, with characters. And so it's not just gameplay that you're watching for, an hour and a half plus, but you're pulled into some kind of narrative, but it still had to have that, like, at its core, the same kind of thing that you loved about the suspense of the video gameplay. And so that was always kind of a leading factor in a lot of the approach for, especially once we're in Freddy's. There's lots of nods and lots of all the other departments working together to create additional Easter eggs and all these other things. For me, photographically, so much because it really pulls from the first game, and it's all about security monitors. So that obviously had to be an aspect we had to really play a big homage to from the video game play, but it had to expand beyond that, and we had to bring our own kind of aesthetics to it as well.
It's hard to make any sort of judgment just because we haven't seen the movie yet. But I'll tell you, I mean, from the trailer, you really get a sense of how invested you are in the security camera experience, right? Like that is so much a part of Mike's experience in there. The piece I'm most interested in when you talk about aesthetics is what your thinking is when you go into thinking about the actual animatronics and making them scary. They kind of do the work themselves, or
well, and especially because, to add on to that question, since it is like, Jim Henson's workshop created these big things, the process of not only like making them scary, but shooting them in a way where you're not seeing the people who are helping move them.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it was absolutely amazing to work with Jim Henson Company, because it already was a big nostalgic fest for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a kid growing up, and it was. They have a creature shop in Burbank, and fortunately, I was brought in very early with when they started having their meetings. When Emma, and initially, I was very fly on the wall with a lot of those creative discussions. But when it started to come down to actually building and stuff, we started to do our camera tests with them very early on. It was very important, I think, for Emma, for Scott, for Blumhouse they wanted to do as much in camera as possible and not rely a lot on CGI. So it was from the get-go, it was like they brought on Jim Henson. And so the initial test was just how do these look on camera? How do you light them? How do they look scary? In what light? How do they move? And then under what configurations? Because there were several. Some are fully animatronic with servos and everything. Some elements had to be with stunt people. And a combination of part stunt, part animatronics, part different things. So a lot of the testing phase was to see what looked great from what direction. And you had other like Foxy, which is all full exoskeleton. So, when you're moving Foxy, you're coming under other more traditional puppeteering, when you're dealing with that. And it was all very exciting for me because I've never worked with puppeteers, and there's all these big teams, and really exciting to see Emma work with them in terms of trying to come up with different personality traits under what conditions they do. For me as a cinematographer, it's just like I said, lighting is there's that fine line of scary to goofy. But what's interesting about Freddy is that there's different tonal things that why I think it's loved by so many is that it's scary, but then there is this kind of levity within it. I mean, I don't think it's not just volume 11 at the horror, there's some other kind of elements in it. And so it was through that testing to find what maybe hits what tone for what and what kind of lighting for what. And, we had what was important for Emma was you have this young character, Abby. You have Mike, who's the main character. He's the security guard. But, Abby's perspective is a very childlike world view versus
right, the actual audience for
the different, and she wanted to play with those kind of ideas. And, we talked a little bit of the Spielberg movie, like Jurassic Park, where you go in, it's all fantastical, and then everything goes wrong. And it's what you were this is amazing is oh, what have we gotten ourselves into? And Spielberg does that so well. So, we wanted to have different facets and different perspective moments with those animatronics. So we tested a lot. And even while filming, you had puppeteers and stunt people, and they had their own core group doing a lot of previs and a lot of discussions with Emma and them to find out. So it wasn't, there was weeks and weeks and weeks of just parsing through all the elements. So, by the time we get in the set, a lot of those things had been figured out. We want that kind of look or want this. And there's always certain things that kind of surprise you on the day, but I mean, to your point, it's it was always on our mind. You don't want it to get so goofy or people are out of their seat and they're oh, I don't buy this moment. And so you're trying to find the right tone because it could potentially go very goofy very quickly. And that was certainly a challenge. When I first read it, I was okay, animatronics, haunted animatronics.
Yeah, it's kind of the entire,
at a pizzeria. You're Cinematographer is like, I haven't really experienced like how do you do this? And for me personally too, I would look at a movie like Alien, the original Ridley Scott, because I mean, not so much that, but when you get like just the glimpses of creatures in your mind in a horror movie, you kind of fill in the gaps. And when you watch the behind the scenes of like Alien and you look at the person in the suit, it looks really,
I know it's so goofy.
And so it's kind of like that same idea. It's like you're kind of parsing out. And a lot of that too is just editorial, on Emma and the editor, like finding those moments. But for me in the test, it was like, what looks good? We wanted to do some shadow play. We wanted to see, what fabric looks good under what light. Emma and I really wanted to use a lot of mixed tones. When you get into a lot of the arcade and kind of neon light elements, and not all colored light looks good on these creatures, so we had to be very sensitive to that. And we wouldn't have been able to do it if had not done all the camera tests.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's very fixture forward. That trailer, when light bulbs go on and signs light up, I am in it. I am like 14 years old at my neighborhood arcade. It looks terrific.
Yeah, it reminds me of like, I had a Showbiz Pizza growing up near me, and took my kids to Chuck E. Cheese, and so these are things that certainly have circulated, and the idea of these places with these giant creatures for kids, I don't know. I think there's just innately something creepy about it, which obviously I think this. Probably the video game probably spurred on things like there was the Banana Split movie, and there was the one with Nicolas Cage, and like there were these other ones where like even that like weird Winnie the Pooh serial killer movie, like big creepy creatures in costumes, and I think this is like right in line with that. But it's really like this is the original because it stemmed from the video game that probably inspired all that stuff. So
that's my understanding. Yeah, I talked to Emma early on, and I don't know what she saw or not, but it was kind of like a very concerted effort that I don't look at any of those other movies, because I was just concerned. I mean, I already kind of knew instinctually what we probably didn't want to do, but I just didn't want to be like have any stress of having seen how somebody else tackled any of this. And I knew there was probably a lot of campiness in some of those, and even though I'm a huge Nicolas Cage fan, so I might go back and watch that.
Yeah. Now that you're done with this one,
but it was very like I had to only drink from the well of Freddy's and really let that consume me, and maybe use some other archetypal movies that we could have some inspiration from. That just really kind of set the tone.
I think, now that you're done, you definitely should watch the Nick Cage one, because it's another one of his truly on-brand, subtle, and nuanced performances.
Yeah.
It's outstanding.
It's very fun.
When you were speaking to like the creep factor, I mean, I did come across, because I was kind of, not to get too heady, but I think it does speak to a lot of horror movies, that Freud had written this essay, in essence said that the things that you loved as a child, you're frightened as an adult. And he kind of used the example that, every child wishes that their doll was alive and could talk to them. But if in fact that never came to fruition, as an adult would be a very frightening thing.
And then we have Megan.
I don't think it's without, it speaks to something internal, because certainly horror movies, when you hear like a nursery rhyme being sung by children in a horror movie, it's a very, and I think we've always kind of had that instinctual element of that duality. And I think it was very fun to have, Freddy's has that. There's a bit of a nostalgic element, but it also speaks to what we loved as children really responded to. And now
that's so great.
You wouldn't want to approach that as adults. So I think it kind of spoke to that thematically, very much.
That's awesome.
That's so true.
Well, we're excited to check it out when it comes out, and certainly wish you all the best of luck with it. I think, though, right now this is a good time to transition our conversation to the massive opus of Magnolia.
Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a line to you from an opera. I want you to give me that line back in the language in which the opera was originally written. And for a bonus $250, you can sing it.
I'm Stanley Spector.
There is the story of a boy genius.
Willa Cather, Thomas Kidd, Jean-Baptiste Beauclerc-Molière.
And the game show host.
I'm Jimmy Gator. live from Burbank, California. First question for 25. This French playwright and actor joined the Béjart troupe of actors.
And the ex-boy genius.
I'm Quiska Donnie Smith. I used to be smart, now I'm just stupid.
There is the story of the dying man.
I'm Earl Partridge.
I have a son, you know.
You do?
Find him.
I'm Frank T.J. Mackey.
His lost son.
What did he say? Because I am not going to take care of him. What does he want?
And the dying man's wife.
I'm Linda Partridge. I took care of him through this, Alan. What now, then? Me and him. Did you understand? There's no one else. No one else.
The caretaker.
I'm Phil Parma.
See, this is the scene of the movie where you helped me out.
And there's the story of a mother.
I'm Rose Gator.
You come home soon after the show. I love you.
Love you too.
And the daughter.
I'm Claudia Wilson Gator.
Now that I've met you, would you object to never seeing me again?
And the police officer in love.
I'm Officer Jim Curring.
My life is very stressful, and I'd hope to have a relationship that is very calm and undemanding and loving. So if you are this person, please leave me a message at box number 82.
And this will all make sense in the end.
I know life is getting shorter. I can't bring myself to set the scene, even when it's approaching torture. I've got my routine.
This is not an easy job. I have to take everything and play as it lays. Sometimes people need a little help. Sometimes people need to be forgiven. And that is a very tricky thing on my part, making that call. But you can forgive someone, well, that's the tough part. What can we forgive?
Was that unclear?
Kind of.
Oh, God.
All right. So, Lyn, let's talk about your first time, if you can remember. Like, when did you see Magnolia, and how did it hit you? Do you recall?
Yes, I was living here in LA at the time. I was living in Santa Monica. I don't remember the exact theater. I feel like I saw it at the Aero Theater, but that's an art house theater. So I don't know if I saw it there or not. I do recall that it was like a single theater type place, because I know I had a big release, but I do remember being absolutely floored when I saw this movie, that I did go back and see it multiple times. I have 2 DVDs of it too, weirdly. And it was right at that moment where, I was already out of college. I had moved here to LA. I'd kind of hopped back and forth from East Coast to West Coast. And you just, I was in my 20s and just really like, what am I doing with my life? And I think it was certainly a pivotal movie because it was so inspirational, and it came from, and I'm just rewatching again the last couple of days. Just like all I could say was just an inspirational movie from the filmmakers, and it was not whatever. The experience was so unlike anything I'd ever seen at that point. It was almost like operatic in a way. I think it was one of the movies at that time that really was like kind of kicked my butt in gear and said, you know what, I really. If I can't make that movie, because I'm probably never going to make that movie. It was like at the one point very discouraging, because you see those movies occasionally. Like, I'm never going to aspire to that film.
So why bother?
Why bother? At the same time, it's like I want to be a part of that.
Yeah,
it was like a very inspirational time. And when I think of like horror movies that just it maybe don't really shape me aesthetically, but just inspire me to want to be part of this community, that was one of them. And like I said, I went back multiple times and watched the movie because it's so dense and so layered. And like I said, I'm a bit intimidated even talking about it because there's so much there.
Yeah, and this is early in Paul Thomas Anderson's career when, as a writer-director, the stories were very big, very bold. He hadn't hit that point in his career when it was the little more kind of intimate stories like The Master, There Will Be Blood, Phantom Thread, things like that, that certainly have, I mean, they're certainly very much Paul Thomas Anderson films, but at the same time, you're not getting like the insane camera moves and just the crazy fast like editing style, jumping from story to story. The story that we're getting in a film like this, which is just like, it really was, revisiting it was kind of mesmerizing to remind myself how much energy he like infused in the film. And you said operatic. I wrote that down in my notes, and bombastic, and just like, and it's so fluid too. And that's just, it's amazing. Like with, 9 dominant characters that we're following over the course of this story, that we're moving so effortlessly from one to the next and back and forth. And yet we're still able to kind of keep tabs on all of them and what they're up to and how it all connects. And it's really amazing to me.
That's why I said it feels like such an inspirational movie. Like it wasn't, I feel like it could only be made by someone who's, I mean, he's obviously an incredible talent, but at the same time, maybe a certain naivete of inspiration that just kind of went forth and said, there's nothing going to stop me to make this movie, because I don't know. And I know it's a lot of critics maybe slammed at the time as feeling pretentious of this, but I just feel like he just jumped off this ledge and just took everybody with him. To me, when watching it, it almost felt beyond movies. It felt like one big composition, right? It just flows. Like I said, there's this real intensity in the beginning to kind of intro everybody. And there's like a pace, like it feels like nothing was ever an afterthought, because music in this is so like ingrained, and obviously the Aimee Mann songs as well, that he was just constructing this composition of peaks and valleys in the tone. And it just feels so compositional because it's so mosaic and layered on top of each other. And then you have these elements that kind of speak outside the narrative, with like the overdub of the music video kind of elements of people singing to the fanatical elements at the ends with the frogs. And it's just, very few people can do it, right? I mean, just watching again just inspired me. Like, how do you do that? Because I know how difficult making a movie. And I think equally as interesting, because I started watching it just to make it's worth, I mean, anybody hearing this, if you haven't seen it, is the making of documentary that was kind of like behind the scenes is also just equally fascinating of how this film just kind of came about.
It is one of those movies that just screams like, this movie couldn't be made another way. And yet one of the complaints is like, 3.5 hours is egregious. To me, this is one of the movies that never feels like 3.5 hours. It's just a breath because it is so propulsive. I want to talk about how you see camera. I mean, this is Robert Elswit. This is legendary camera. It is, we've talked about There Will Be Blood on this show. That's another Elswit. We've got just a lot. He's a legendary guy. As a cinematographer, you watch this movie. What inspires you about how this movie was shot?
I mean, it's interesting because there's kind of like two counterpoints in terms of the cinematography, because it's almost like two separate things. There's camera work and then there's lighting. And in some ways, they're kind of counterpoint to each other, because if you take away all the camera work, the lighting is not garish in my opinion. It's not like it's dramatic, but it's all like lifted from very realistic like motivations. It's augmented to what you would have realistically. But then you look at the camera work separately. I mean, very early. I mean, there's whip pans and the cameras move very quickly, and you could say it's almost like kind of an early maybe inspiration from like a Scorsese, like you think of Raging Bull in the bull, fighting sequences, and there's whips into pushes, and there's like energy, and I know it's very early, like kind of spoke to each character. Like the kid is running late to the Stanley, who's going to be in the What Kids Will Know. Early on when you're introduced, it's very handheld and very like they're running late, and Julianne Moore's character in that intro is very different than, Philip Seymour Hoffman or John C. Reilly's character, let's say. it was a lot more stable in other ways. So it's like totally different. I think the lighting wise was a much more subtle kind of nuanced element. You know, how you see into people's eyes. I was rewatching it because that's something as a cinematographer, I think I kind of obsess on now that when I watched it, my 20s is not something I'm really thinking of craft because I hadn't really started. I'm just taking it as a full experience, but you start finding it. And Elswit's lighting, I think, just a lot of great subtleties of how well you see into eyes and, what directions people are lit from. And to me, it was like eyes, the way you think of eyes from like The Godfather, which everyone talks about, and the overhead lighting, which is a lot of, and, so much of this movie is about forgiveness and obviously what was you say that, we might be done with the past is not done with us. And I think if you just watch this movie about, can you see into someone's eyes or not? And do I trust this person? I think really was a storyline for Elswit in this. And watching the behind the scenes, you see a little bit of P.T. Anderson having initial talk with Elswit about it. And Elswit asked him, do you see this as a different look for every scene or every character? And P.T. Anderson talks about it. It's like he wants it to look the same all the way through, that he didn't want there to be variations, because from his mind, he saw it as one story. And I found that very fascinating because it makes sense. You see like all the like 9 different characters, all these stories, like, am I giving a different look for everything? It's like that was this baseline. And then it's the camera work that really, like, the lighting grounds you, but the camera work and when it's intense and when it's more slow pace, and that's the thing that really like has the peaks and valleys, and it's the lighting that really keeps you stabilized in it. And so I think there's a lot of sophistication there, because I think in a young DP, you're going to say, well, let me flex my muscles
right
on the lighting wise. And I think there's just a lot of understated, very subtle things that Elswit did in this movie.
Well, and that's, I suppose there's a real line there as far as like working with the director. And I think Anderson has certainly proven himself a director who understands the language of cinema and how to use all of the different elements at his disposal to kind of tell the stories that he's telling. And working with someone like Elswit, deciding like when we're going to use the whip pans because this is going to give us that energy, and we're going to like just the character introductions, like as we whip over into Jimmy Gator when he's like doing an introduction or something, and the camera flies in toward him, and we have a really fantastic oneer when Stanley arrives, and we kind of follow, and it's just like kind of his Boogie Nights face.
Yes,
he's just all over the place. We're going
right.
everywhere, but then you're also looking at it struck me that there was a scene between John C. Reilly and Melora Walters where it's when he comes into her house and the music's really loud. And
right when he first
when he first meets her, and it's around the time when she's given him the coffee, and it's a oneer, and like we're staring at the two of them for a very long time, just having a conversation, and as the director knowing, okay, this is also going to be a oneer, we're going to allow these two performers to actually give the scene the energy that it needs. I don't need to be moving the camera all over the place. I don't need to be cutting. I'm just going to allow it to live and breathe as is, as opposed to other times when he does have some other fast cuts. And that's the interesting thing, that I suppose as the director and the DP working closely together to make sure that they understand the way that the energy is flowing through the film, especially knowing that, these films are completely shot out of order and it all gets edited and stuff gets cut and left on the editing room floor. And so it's like trying to figure out, we want to keep this energy here. And then, tomorrow we're going to be filming a scene that is at the end of the movie, and we really need a lot of energy. And, it's complicated, and it's the exciting nature of film.
It's a very thought out paced movie in that way. And yeah, there are a lot of scenes that don't cut, where a lot of emotional scenes. I mean, maybe there's a cut of a back and forth, but it largely like holds on a performance when it needs to hold on a performance. Yeah, it's not like you're just doing coverage in a movie. Like there's real intention to what they're doing when, for what scene. And watching, I just feel very guided and assured from a very good, like an amazing filmmaker in that way. Yeah, I mean, there's some amazing performance. The two scenes that, I mean, maybe it's not really similar, but I do think even it's Tom Cruise's best performance in the movie.
He's so good in this. So good. Yeah.
And that scene that he has with Jason Robards is like incredible. And then a scene, and I've always mentioned this too, like talking to my wife about it, but like the Julianne Moore scene when she goes into the pharmacy.
I was absolutely going to bring that up.
I still like her performance at, and it's not very long, but the whole like shame on you scene, like there's just incredible performances and so emotional and like so peak defying that it's, yeah, you're drawn in. It always gave me chills, that one particular scene with the Julianne Moore in the pharmacy scene, and just
the passive aggressive pharmacist,
the passive aggressive, and her just like shame on you, and
there are those sequences of vulnerability are like throughout this movie. They like perforate the movie, right? Because I think, I have to go to the bathroom is another one of those, like the shame that is felt when he's sitting on that stage under the spotlights. And then again, when Riley looks across at her and says, "I lost my gun today." Like that is soul-crushing performance right there. Soul-crushing demonstration of vulnerability on screen. And all of these moments tie together. When you talk about this as a film about forgiveness, yeah, I mean, that is what defines the essence of this movie, is these performances, these people.
And it's like you said, it doesn't, he's not whip panning around those scenes. Like he knows what you use at what time. And it's like, the performance lifts the moment. You're not going to like go crazy with the camera. You want to be on that performance, but he creates the energy in certain places, and I'd be curious how that process worked with him and Elswit, like how mapped out, because obviously he had this in his head. He knew the vision he wanted because it's so mapped out in a way.
I imagine it like an investigation map, like something that John and Christopher Nolan would put together, right? Like it feels that intertwined and interwoven.
Yeah. And really figuring out, like, does it make sense to cut from this story here to that story, and then figuring out, what makes sense as a transition. And there were some beautiful transitions that I had forgotten about as like one character would say something, and I'm forgetting which one it is now. I didn't write down, but it was something like Tom Cruise says something when he's up on stage, and whatever he says, we cut to somebody else, and it was just like it was timed perfectly to cut to that character because of what he had just said led us into like what they were doing. And that's like, I just imagine the screenwriting process too from the beginning, like thinking about how can I take all these and like mesh them.
Yeah. I can't even I can't even speak to screen. I mean, I'm not a screenwriter for Trey, but I had heard him speak a couple times, where he talked, at least for writing Magnolia, that he saw it as, he talked about it as ironing, and that he would write and then go back and to the beginning and then write a little bit further and go back and refine and write a little bit further. So he envisioned it as like you're ironing this sheet, and then you go back and you go a little bit further and a little bit further. And so he kept on, that was his process as he described it, for writing it. To go back to your point, the idea that he would end on one, like the Tom Cruise element, the JT Mackey thing, and then go into another, it reminds me of that idea, like the cinematography, like he wants all the look to be tonal. I think there's a real grounded, so he allowed that he could flow from one thing to another kind of effortlessly in a narrative way, and you never feel like you're lost in any way. It's like the emotions pushing us forward. That's why it just feels like a music composition to me. Like I'm not really thinking of, you go back and be analytical about it and how all these stories intertwine in a very heady way, but just from like the first viewing it, you're just kind of being pushed along emotionally, and each story kind of informs the next, and it's all kind of one arc in a way for everybody. that just kind of keeps pushing forward. And I think that's how maybe he saw it, maybe subconsciously. And so he wasn't as concerned about drifting from story to story and whether you're lost or not, because it's all pushing together, to one like culmination.
I think the unification of kind of that operatic feel paired with having so much Aimee Mann music, which you already had brought up, and how her voice, her lyrical sense, like the way that she crafts songs kind of feel of these characters, kind of this world.
Yeah.
And just also just smartly figuring out, okay, I'm telling a pretty big story with a lot of crazy things happening. Even just figuring out, I need to set this movie up with examples of crazy things that happen. I mean, really, in quotes, happened. And we get these 3 stories that are completely unrelated to the movie, but at the very beginning that just set us up for, and this also happens, which leads, of course, through all of this, and then to the end with the raining of the frogs. And it just like everything, he's telling you right out of the gate, I'm telling a pretty fantastical story full of heightened emotions and raw energy and humanity. And there's going to be a lot going on here, but I'm setting this world up so that you understand it and you can get into it. And I know some people who had a hard time right out of the gate saying, it's just too much for me. I just can't take it. But but I think that it's there. I think like right out of the gate, he's put it all there. And so it's smart to craft it that way.
Yeah. That little like prologue element, and with Ricky Jay doing the narration.
Such a perfect voice for it.
So miss Ricky
He was
Jay.
like a magician, right? So he's all about the setup, right? Like you see that prologue and it happens, and then that like organ, kind of electric organ of One Is the Loneliest Number starts playing right after that prologue. I mean, I can't, because I'm not a super analytical person, like what this is, but at least for me, like I feel assured that I'm going to be taken on a journey in this movie.
Yeah.
In this very interesting way. So I can't see the movie without that prologue. Like,
oh yeah, no.
It's interesting because when I talk about like also the photography being very grounded, and yet you have these very ungrounded moments of just like that music video, like everyone sings
just a line or two.
There's that 3-minute interlude of everyone, this big emotional release. And when do you see that in a movie? Like how often in something like that, like, and maybe that does set us up enough with the frogs, because you're on this like emotional journey and you accept it. Like to me is like the most amazing, like you see everyone in their various facets of where they are in this boat. And I don't know if anything else expresses that better than them singing the lyrics of an Aimee Mann song in each of their like elements of that beat. It just kind of like becomes this poetic, expressive moment that kind of transcends anything that would have dialogue happen, or it really puts you in the seat of where the headspace is of all these various characters. And for me, I'm in on it. Like I'm watching it, and there's never a moment I'm like, whoa, it's like, but it works. Like to me, it so works in this movie.
It keeps them all isolated, yet at the same time unifies every single one of those characters, which I find so fascinating.
Again, it's like pushing that one emotion. It's all like everyone's on the same kind of trajectory. And I think that's why it ultimately, I come away with like a feeling of it. And I'm not trying to understand like how does every story, on multiple viewings, I understand it more. But on that first viewing, it was just like this one big emotional, visceral reaction to it, And I was like, what did I just see? I have to go back.
Right. Well, it's not every day you watch a movie that the big climax is raining of frogs, where you're like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah. It's beautiful. I mean, it ties to one of my favorite movies that Andy doesn't like, Big Fish. It's like those kinds of experiences, like the synchronicity of experience. And I think that's the frogs to me. Like, if you didn't get it, that a number of these stories take place on Magnolia Boulevard, like this is the world that we're in. As you were talking about, the lighting, the visual style is consistent across all these characters. It's another thing that brings these together. If you didn't get it yet, it rains frogs on everybody. Okay. Do you get it now? Like, we're all together at the same time. And I think that's a pretty special thing. You talk about ironing, like I would love to see the original script, like the pre-ironed script, because the finished one's 216 pages. Imagine what was whittled away from that original script. Like that must have been extraordinary.
And I think, I mean, don't fully quote. This is just like back in my memory, but I think I remember him talking. I think he might have written a lot of stuff initially, like longhand on a legal pad. I think that's what was. But I at least probably the outlines and notes and all this factor. Yeah, I would have loved to seen his process and seen that original piece, because it, like you said, it probably was even more expansive and had to be whittled down to this.
Well, and I think an entire character thread was cut, in the process of all of this, just to get it to the length that he had. And I don't know if I can't remember who. I think it might have been the worm or something tied into that story thread. I can't remember exactly.
Yes, I did see there are some deleted scenes with the worm and also the kid that raps, and a little bit of that storyline as well. But I don't entirely know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Andy, how'd Magnolia do at awards season? Did it win all the awards?
This was a very popular film in the awards circles. Definitely, they pretty much planned that with the December release and everything. 28 wins with 59 other nominations. The Oscars, of course, is a good one for Cruise this whole award season. He was nominated at the Oscars for supporting actor, but of course lost to Michael Caine in The Cider House Rules. That was that fantastic Michael Caine speech where he talks about each of their characters and everything. That was a good one. Aimee Mann's song "Save Me," one of the I think 2 original songs she wrote for the film, was nominated, but lost to Phil Collins' song "You'll Be in My Heart" for Tarzan.
Chronic earworm, that song. Wow.
Well,
don't start singing it.
Okay, I won't. Also, Paul Thomas Anderson was nominated for original screenplay, but lost to American Beauty. It was 1999. This was a very full year of very interesting films, and so they talk about great years in cinema. 99 was certainly one of them, and this was right up there with them. I mean, it was such a busy year that it wasn't even nominated for Best Picture, which I think it very well could have been. At the Golden Globes, which we haven't really been talking about in a while, but I wanted to talk about it in this one because this was one that Tom Cruise won Best Supporting Actor, and of course was one of the Golden Globes that he returned in 2021 when the Hollywood Foreign Press Association was falling apart. So he has not since been invited back to any of their ceremonies. I'm sure other people haven't either, because it was, they kind of made a mess of things. And then Aimee Mann's song also lost to the Phil Collins song there.
It is a bummer. But how did it do at the box office for a 3.5-hour movie? Did it make anything back?
Well, Anderson had a strong $37 million to make this anthology film, which is almost $67 million in today's dollars. The movie opened limited December 17th, 1999 on 7 screens opposite Stuart Little, Bicentennial Man, Anna and the King, Any Given Sunday, and Man on the Moon. Like typical busy holiday seasons, it stayed limited until January 7th, 2000, when it went wide and shot up to 7th place. It fell out of the top 10 the very next week, but it did remain popular enough through its 10th week when it fell out of the top 20. The movie went on to earn almost $22.5 million domestically and $26 million internationally, for a total gross of $87.7 million in today's dollars. That, paired with its award successes, made this film a success and landed it with an adjusted profit per finished minute of about $110,000. I mean, in the process of thinking about a film like this and looking at the performances, it does make me wonder, like, how much... and this is, always something I'm curious about with films, but like, how much rehearsal are they are they getting? I know it can be a real rarity in film these days to like actually have time to rehearse, but I feel like in something like this with so many characters, just as the director, I would imagine how helpful it can be to just like hear these characters and hear how they're working and just being able to kind of picture how they all are going to be fitting into the world. But I don't know. I mean, have you had a lot of rehearsal time on films that you've been involved in?
No, what I've seen from directors and actors of the projects I've worked on, they typically come in like a week before you shoot almost. I mean, and they do their fittings, and then I feel like, maybe you get a table read, but oftentimes they'll workshop a couple of one or two essential scenes, maybe if enough actors are there, or a couple of things. And that's why I've seen it. I've never been on a movie where I've seen the director have a luxury of rehearsal time. It's not like a Mike Leigh movie or one of these things where, it's all rehearsed and then they don't have a script per se or that kind of thing. And so for me, I always have a little bit of that pressure because you want to make sure the director has as much time on set with an actor. So just from a pragmatic standpoint, you're trying to make sure you're not wasting anyone's time, their due diligence to be able to have that time on set. So unfortunately, I haven't been on a project that gets a lot of that leeway.
Well, and I think with digital cameras, it's probably even less likely because you can just we'll just shoot all the rehearsals, we'll do it all inside. I feel like that was probably something a lot more with film where it's just like, it's so expensive. We don't have a ton of money to do. And now it's just like,
Yeah, it very much. There's more of that culture now where it's like, why wouldn't we roll?
Yeah.
You know, and I understand it too. I mean, being on set, maybe there's certain things you have to rehearse, obviously. You don't want to let everything go and you'd be totally chaos on set, but it makes sense that a director would be like, I wish we had filmed that, and so I think more so now you're like, we'll discover it as we do it. And you tend to just shoot what would be a rehearsal maybe in film sense. And that's more the thing. And you're always squeezed on schedules, and actor schedules can be very difficult also. So that time is probably less and less of that rehearsal process. And that's, I'm certainly aware, and I try to do the best I can to make sure directors have as much time as they need on set. But I don't know. I mean, watching the behind the scenes, I don't know if was a lot of rehearsal I'd be curious. I think they really just
shoot the vignettes, get them in,
did
shoot
it. I
them,
mean,
and move it on.
What was interesting and I was just watching the Jason Robards, like before he did the scene, he was like in a coma before being on this movie.
Yeah, I think he had just come off of like having a serious staph infection that had like really kind of knocked him out, and he actually he had to decline the part initially because of all of that, and then they went to George C. Scott, who ended up passing, and then by that time Robards was healthy again, or healthy enough again to do it, and so he was able to do it, and then of course it sadly ended up being his last film. But I mean, what a way to go out. I mean, just his moments in this film are heartbreaking, and just like that, the regret and just the pain and the confusion and all of those moments, I think it speaks so much to, as much as P.T. Anderson is a technical director with the camera wizardry and just the movement and the style that he infuses it with, he is so much an actor's director, allowing them the time they need to really like put their raw emotion right there on screen. It's just, I mean, it's amazing that he is able to kind of capture all of that so well.
Totally. I mean, and also in the making of, he talks about like the movie Network, and then he talks about a lot of the performances from
Such
that.
a good movie.
But
yeah.
He obviously is, like you said, I think he is an actor's director. He's not going to do something that's not in service of a performance of his movies. He's not going to cut away from a great performance. Yeah, and there's a lot of really good performances in this movie.
Yeah, right.
Every one of them.
And it's interesting, like he directs these actors to such amazing performances, and the actors are like so terrified of what have I just done? Like Burt Reynolds and Boogie Nights. Like, I'm so afraid of this, but it's like one of his best performances. He's so good in that movie. And Tom Cruise with this one, like, didn't want to do any publicity because it's like, I don't know. I don't feel like it's not who I like the sort of role I normally take. So I'm a little reticent to publicize it. And then he's like getting awards up the wazoo.
Well, I think people hadn't really seen. I mean, he was a new director that people.
It was only his third movie. I mean, geez,
it's crazy.
It's like you don't see any behind the scenes stuff with Tom Cruise. You don't see any this, like you said, the promotion. But it is that performance with the Jason Robards is just so, like, it is, in my opinion, his best performance in the movie.
Just so heartbreaking.
And he plays it so well. He plays that persona of what he's trying to be. Have that persona of that kind of like ultra male thing that's going on. And then the vulnerability that you start to discover when you start to peel away all this front that he has through that interview. And you start to learn like it. I mean, kudos to him to even undertake to what he was at the time and where he's going, like to undertake that character.
Yeah.
And then he's earned that moment when he has that just emotional breakdown. And I don't know, it's always surprising when I see him in it because it's so unexpected.
Right. Yeah. Very big. Well, I mean, there's so much we could talk about with this. It has been an incredible conversation already. I feel like we've kind of used up our time. But, Lyn, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this movie. It is just a masterpiece, and it's absolutely a thrill to chat with you about it. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. It was great to revisit the movie again. And I think has now inspired me to move forward to try to find my Magnolia,
That's right. You may proceed. We stand and await.
Absolutely. Do you have any places out there online that you would that we should direct people to go check out where they can see what you're up to?
My website, lynmoncrief.com. You can see some of my other work that I've done in years past. And then I do a little bit of Instagram, not much, but I'm starting to. I'd probably interact more on that. People email me here and there and I respond to them, but it's at Lyn Moncrief on the Instagram. So I'm easy to find online.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have the links for all that in the show notes. So everybody definitely check it out. We'll also throw in the links for some of the movies that you've been a part of so people can go watch those as well. Again, Lyn, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And for everybody else out there, we hope you liked the show, and we certainly hope you liked the movie like we do here on Movies We Like. Movies We Like is a part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network and is produced by me, Andy Nelson. The music is Chomp Clap by Out of Flux. Find the show at truestory.fm and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Letterboxd at The Next Reel. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, we always appreciate it if you drop one in there for us. See you next time. It's hard to believe that we have been having in-depth weekly conversations about movies since 2011.
So many great conversations over the years about so many great movies. All that said, producing this show week after week requires a ton of work behind the scenes.
Becoming a Next Reel member gives you access to all sorts of additional and exclusive content. Plus, you're helping us keep the lights on. Just head to thenextreel.com/membership, where you can learn more about becoming a member, which costs a measly $5 a month, practically the same as one fancy coffee drink. And you get so much more.
Every month, we record a bonus episode exclusively for members. Those episodes cover movies from whatever series we're covering at the moment or add to previous series.
Some movies we've covered that only members get to hear us discuss include The Blues Brothers,
The Russia House,
Naked Lunch,
Independence Day,
The Hot Rock,
and Relic, the better one. Plus, members get to vote on what we're going to discuss for those episodes.
We also record additional pre- and post-show content in regular episodes that only members get to hear.
like conversations about similarly themed movies.
And answering listener questions from our live member chat.
Speaking of our live member chat, we record almost all of our episodes in Discord, where members can chat right along with us live.
Members get access to other members-only channels in our Discord community as well. On top of all that, members get all episodes a full week earlier than everyone else in a private Next Reel feed just for them that includes all the shows in the Next Reel family. The Next Reel, the Film Board,
movies we like, Sitting in the Dark, and more new projects on the way.
To top it all off, members don't have to listen to ads. We've already eliminated those annoying, dynamically inserted ads that, let's face it, we all hated.
We are listening to you.
We love podcasting for a living, and those ads help to pay the bills. Now, we're counting on you, dear listener.
We promise we aren't going back to those terrible, dynamically inserted ads that don't relate to us at all. All we ask is that you consider supporting the Next Reel family of podcasts with a membership.
Again, it's $5 per month or $55 per year. Just head to thenextreel.com/membership.
thenextreel.com/membership. Get your access to early, ad-free episodes with bonus content, member bonus episodes, and access to member channels and live streams in Discord by signing up today.